This is the story of men and women who have made nations great. Those who had a dream and in many cases died for it. It is the story of courage, perseverance, tenacity and greed. And while this story is set in Australia, it could be in any country where people driven by an insatiable search for great wealth risked all. The stakes were high and the success rates were low. Many characters became part of our folklore, and in some cases myth may have overtaken fact. But there is no denying one fact. These were no ordinary people. They were the Prospectors. Australia in 1851 was losing its small colonial population to the Californian goldfields. But a flamboyant man by the name of Edward Hargreaves was about to change all that. Hargreaves had recognised the similarity between Bathurst and the Californian goldfields from which he had recently returned. He was certain there was gold at Bathurst, and after much ridicule from the Sydney public, the lone figure rode into the bush in the beginning of 1851. It was a ride into history. Along the way, he recruited a guide, a young man by the name of John Lister. And on the 12th of February, they arrived at Lewis Ponds Creek.
I found myself in country I was anxiously longing to behold again. My recollection had not deceived me. The resemblance to that of the California goldfields could not be mistaken. I felt myself surrounded by gold. My guide went for water to drink, and after making a hasty repast, I told him that we were now in the gold fields and that the gold was under his feet. I dug a pan full of dirt and washed it. The young boy stared in disbelief. There, in the bottom of the pan, lay a speck of the precious metal. I then washed 5 panfuls in succession, obtaining gold from all but one. To describe my feelings at that eventful moment would be impossible.
And so the first gold rush in Australia was about to begin. The two men were joined by Lister's friends James and William Tom, and Hargreaves set out to claim the large reward for discovering Australia's first payable goldfield. Meanwhile, the boys continued to work along the riverbank, but with little success. They then moved several miles downstream to the junction at Summerhill Creek, where in 5 days they recovered 4 ounces of the precious metal.
Tom, look, there's gold.
Finally, this was payable gold. Woo-hoo! Word spread slowly at first when Hargreaves announced his discovery to a disbelieving public. But within a few months, hundreds of prospectors converged on Bathurst, some hastily carrying their belongings and others in well-organised parties. The government quickly imposed a tax of 30 shillings a month on each digger, and in June the Commissioner of Lands reached Ophir, named by Hargreaves after the biblical city of gold.
I saw over 1,000 prospectors camped along the creek, and I collected the tax with little trouble, as fortunes were being won by the early diggers.
As the rich surface gold quickly ran out, new ground was found in the surrounding areas. In July, 50 miles to the north of Bathurst, a prospector brought into town several large quartz nuggets containing over 1,200 ounces of gold. And New South Wales went mad again as this golden area was rushed. In recognition of the initial discovery, Hargreaves was given a reward of £10,000 by the government. However, storm clouds began to appear on the horizon. Lister and the Tom brothers protested about the reward, claiming they were the true discoverers of the first payable goldfield. The tenacious Lister pursued justice for over 40 years, until finally, just before Hargraves's death, the second inquiry found in favour of the boys.
Although Mr Hargraves is entitled to the credit of having taught the claimants, Messrs W and J Tom, and Mr Lister, the use of the dish and the cradle, and otherwise the proper methods of searching for gold, this committee is satisfied that Messrs Tom and Lister were undoubtedly the first discoverers of gold in Australia in payable quantities.
After 40 years and 2 official inquiries, Lister and the Tom brothers received the sum of a little over £300 each, while Hargraves's name is indelibly carved in Australian history. But his find had captured the imagination of the population, and thousands of prospectors started moving into the interior searching for gold.
The finds at Bathurst spurred the southern state of Victoria into action. Fearing the newly separated colony would lose its population to the New South Wales rushes, it also offered substantial rewards.
High market price of gold, read all about it.
And in August 1851, a prospector named Regan took shelter from the rain underneath a wattle tree. While sitting there, he idly scratched the mud with his boot and found gold and the incredibly rich Ballarat goldfields.
The early prospectors dug hundreds of ounces of gold in a day, 10 years' wages. Others would quickly race back to Melbourne, eager to spend their newfound wealth. And Melbourne went mad with gold fever.
The whole town is in hysterics. Gentlemen foaming at the mouth, ladies fainting, children throwing somersaults, and all on account of the extraordinary news at Ballarat.
But within a month, Ballarat's thousands of shallow pits were soon depleted of their rich surface gold. It wouldn't be till later that the huge underground reserves would be discovered. The prospectors then rushed quickly to the next new find, just 40 miles to the north, at Mount Alexander, near Castlemaine. Here, 15 square miles of rich ground was there for the taking.
Hundreds walked away with fortunes of gold dug out of the shallow ground in the first few weeks. Victoria rapidly took over from New South Wales as the golden capital of Australia, as thousands of gold seekers flooded to the new fields.
1851 was a big year in Australia for gold discovery. And in November, Margaret Kennedy and Mrs Farrell discovered another massive find at Bendigo.
We got a great deal of gold in the first few weeks while working alone. We found a lot in the banks of the creek and in the sods of the grass. You could shut your eyes and get gold in a dish anywhere.
When the journalist Henry Frenchin came across the find in December, he announced it to the press as a Christmas box to the nation, and Bendigo was rushed. The pedestrian population of Melbourne was visibly depleted as the town went crazy in the haste to find their own El Dorado. Ships lay idle in the harbour as entire crews deserted. Businesses had to close as their staff and managers departed for the fields. The roads were crowded with travellers, drays and wheelbarrows, in a mixed confusion from magistrates to labourers. The next few years saw new fields opening up all over the state.
The welcome stranger nugget was unearthed just 1 foot below the surface. A massive lump of gold weighing over 2,000 ounces, the largest nugget in the world.
New diggings discovered!
As the news spread around the world, Melbourne boomed. as tens of thousands of immigrants arrived, all hopeful of striking it rich in the Australian colony. The wealth that these fields provided made Melbourne the Australian capital of opulence and stimulated the economies of the other Commonwealth nations as gold was sold around the world. But the oppressive British governor of the time, Charles Hotham, was becoming increasingly concerned.
The fledgling community is being put to great inconvenience when servants and labourers head off to the fields. Masters have been seen driving their own drays. Ladies of respectability and ample means are obliged to do their own washing.
To restrain the population and raise more funds for the colony, the governor increased the policing of the much despised licences for prospecting. The prospectors were becoming increasingly resentful with the frequency and diligence of licence checks. Those unable to afford the expensive monthly licence were arrested and locked up to await the visiting magistrate. It was an unfair and ruthless system. There were other injustices too, which compounded their grievances. The prospectors wanted the right to vote, to parliamentary representation, and an inquiry into police corruption. Public protests were organised, and by mid-1854, events were escalating towards what was to become Australia's first armed rebellion against government. When a young man named Scobie was kicked to death by the owner of the Eureka Hotel, who was later acquitted by a corrupt magistrate, his hotel was burnt to the ground by the angry mob. A young Irishman by the name of Peter Layla became their leader, and a stockade of timber was built.
The grievances under which we have long suffered and the brutal attack of that day flashed across my mind, and with the burning feelings of an injured man, I mounted the stump and proclaimed, "Liberty!"
We swear by the Southern Cross to stand by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties.
In these hot and humid conditions, hundreds were preparing arms to defend their rights. The heavily armed police and troopers massed in the hills nearby, and a tense standoff developed. At dawn, on December the 3rd, the troopers attacked. Within 30 minutes, the rebellion was smashed. As dawn rose, the stockade was burning, and history had been written. 5 troopers were killed, and Layla listed 14 dead and 8 fatally wounded.
The battle at Eureka was a vital chapter in Australia's history. The government finally conceded to the prospectors' demands and replaced the expensive monthly licence fee with a yearly miner's right, which also carried with it the right to vote. From that turmoil and chaos came recognition, and ironically, Peter Layla went on to become a member of the Victorian Parliament.
I said, my young Australian, that the fight was lost and won when they gave us all we asked for, when we asked for it in blood.
Australia in the 1850s was essentially a European settlement in an Aboriginal-dominated land. But the discovery of gold changed all that. Over the next 10 years, hundreds of thousands of prospectors converged on the country from all over the world, trebling Australia's population. The industrious Chinese arrived by the thousands. By mid-1850, there were over 60,000 on the goldfields. At Ballarat, they were making good money out of the abandoned workings, and throughout the country their presence began to be resented. racial bashings occurred, and the government, through taxes and other measures, began to restrict Asian immigration. The Chinese prospectors were then forced to supply more of the ancillary services, such as market gardens and laundries, as these were occupations offering little competition to the Europeans.
As the mines in Victoria went deep, huge reserves were discovered in the ancient creek beds buried below. Bendigo had a massive 30 buried parallel reefs that ran along a strip of land just 5 miles long by 1 mile wide. The buried chambers revealing nuggets and gold specks that glittered like stars in the night.
Australia was becoming an Aladdin's cave of precious metals. As a prospector made his way up the east coast, new finds were being made along the way. Queensland had seen a few small finds before, and Canoona, 20 miles outside of Rockhampton, was rushed in 1858 when 60 ounces of its coarse dark gold was put on display in a shop in Sydney. The southern regions were being overworked, and prospective diggers deluged ship owners with demands for travel to the new fields. Thousands descended on the small find, and the local residents of Rockhampton must have believed another Bendigo had been found. But the diggings dried up just as quickly as they were found.
Those grey old diggers, they will not rest. They follow the old drays into the west. They tramp all the gullies and hills and flats in search of Eurekas and Ballarats.
While prospectors fought over a few ounces at Canoona, behind them an ironstone mountain containing an astonishing 250 tonnes of gold was waiting to be discovered. Thousands who turned back for home passed by the mountain, and Rockhampton returned to what it was before the rush, about 4 houses and a pub. It wouldn't be until 15 years later that the town's rich secret would be unlocked. Australia's next major discovery was in Gympie in 1867. James Nash, like thousands of others, had come north from the New South Wales and Victorian goldfields. He was a quiet and secretive man who always liked travelling alone. At a creek, while waiting for his billy to boil, he panned for gold and hit some colour. Further up the creek, he found a spot rich in nuggets. Nash rode the 60 miles to Maryborough to restock and buy more tools. He tried to pay with the gold he had found, but had trouble trading the nuggets.
I tried several stores and 2 banks, but couldn't sell my gold. Times were so bad that they hardly knew what gold looked like. At last I tried Mr. Sutherland's store a second time, and he allowed me £3 for it, 1 in money and the rest in tools and rations.
While at Maryborough, Nash managed to keep his discovery at Gympie Creek a secret. No mean feat in those times when even the hint of a gold find would have spread like wildfire. He slipped out of town, making sure he wasn't being followed.
Back at Gympie, Nash recovered 75 ounces of gold within 6 days. Now convinced he was onto a genuine discovery, he raced back to Maryborough to register a claim. Word spread and there was a stampede, with most of the stores being cleared within a day. Pandemonium broke out and fights flared up all over the fields as each tried to peg a claim. Once the richness of the Gympie field was realised, even more people came. Farmers left their land and even the sugar harvest came to a standstill. Those too late moved further north to the new discoveries at Ravenswood and Charters Towers, and then eventually all the way up to the harsh tropics of the Palmer River.
But the Ironstone Mountain still held its secret. Traditionally, ironstone wasn't gold-bearing rock, and so the early prospectors who had seen it had quickly moved on. When the Morgan brothers brought the renowned Sydney geologist Dr. James Robertson to the area to look over some potential copper deposits, they too showed him the mountain.
There's complete absence from the stone. It's ferruginous in character, without a trace of copper in it.
After several days looking over various sites, he became increasingly frustrated with the Morgans, who had brought him all this way to these non-existent copper deposits. Undeterred, the Morgans went back another day. Rain had set in this time, and the water glistened on the rocks. Boulders that looked deceptively ordinary when dry now sparkled in the sunlight. They were too ignorant to share in the geologist's prejudice against ironstone, and had it assayed anyway. And Mount Morgan went on to contain its 250 tonnes of the yellow metal, a real mountain of gold. It was so wealthy, in fact, that one of its owners, William Darcy, financed further prospecting in the Persian Gulf area, where discoveries there led to the formation of British Petroleum.